Good morning, everybody. You will get a coffee break, but you need to stay awake, and because we have really important things to talk about. And we have a fantastic panel. We have some people joining us later. I have a statement I can read. One of our, Ramona Siqueira, is unable to join us. She had an emergency, but we have a lot to talk about. So I wanted to start off this panel about diversity and say that the lack of diversity in trials is not a new problem. I don't know if are we displaying the slides? Can you see if the slides can be displayed? There we go. Perfect. So this has been a long-standing problem, and we simply haven't solved it. And we're hoping to hear about why and what it is that we're going to do about it. It's been very slow to change. Very timely publication in BMJ from a couple of days ago basically was a survey on trials from through 2017. This was looking at novel oncology products approved by the FDA from January of 2012 to 2017. They were looking at transparency and representation of women, older adults, and racial and ethnic minority patients. They looked at the trial level, the product level, the sponsor level, and I would recommend that everyone read this article. Turns out that there were 59 novel products approved. There were 25 sponsors and 64 pivotal trials. Remarkably, only 24% even reported on race and ethnicity. How did these even get to publication without that? And we're going to hear later from Congresswoman Eshoo about her bill that got through the omnibus that is now going to make this a requirement, reporting a requirement. Things are changing. And we on this panel collectively are going to make sure that things change. So let's go to the next slide. And it's very interesting. This was so why is this really important? I was asked to write a commentary about a trial that was reported in New England Journal about a CDK4/6 inhibitor in advanced breast cancer and published in the New England Journal. And as I was reading through the paper, I noted that the accrual of African American women was 2.5%. And yet, it's in the New England Journal. And so why does this matter? In the I-SPY trial, this is a platform adaptive trial that we run where we have 12% African American women, and this is not an accident. It's by design of where our centers are and who our trial leaders are. It turns out in this trial, giving these drugs before surgery, if you have a complete response to therapy, you have the same great outcome as anybody else. But surprisingly, where people really are in trouble, if you do not, so down here in this lower right-hand graph, if you have hormone receptor positive disease and you do not have a complete response to therapy, your chance of dying is 2.5 times higher if you are African American than if you are white. And yet, enrollment of African American women in that pivotal trial that was about this very topic was less than 2.5%. So how is that, right? And everybody benefits from greater knowledge. We have just simply not achieved this goal. So this is one of the reasons, just one example of why we're talking about this today. And I'm joined by Dr. Patrizia Cavazzoni, who leads the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And I'm going to turn this over to Patrizia for her introductory remarks, and then we'll get into it with the panel. Patrizia.
Thank you, Laura, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to join today. I am going to provide a few remarks from FDA's standpoint. I cannot see the slides, so I'm just going to call for the numbers of slides, if that's okay. So if we could go to the first slide after the title slide. And assuming that you can all see that, I'm going to start off by saying that it is a given that enrollment in clinical trials should reflect the diversity of the population that will ultimately be using the product. And while this seems to be an unequivocal statement, as you have heard from Laura, and as we see from countless examples, we're clearly not there yet. We have made significant progress in certain areas. However, there are other areas where we are still dealing with a clear lack of diversity in recruitment for clinical trials, which then translates to evidence that doesn't necessarily tell us how the drug will perform in those people who will take it after it's approved. Now, FDA has a number of tools at its disposal to advance diversity in clinical trials, including guidance, including developing tools that are then also sort of reflected in guidance, and encouraging the use of innovative trial designs. And I would add one more thing that I will speak to later in my remarks, is that I think that FDA, as other agencies, including NIH, have a role in striving to simplify clinical trials and getting to a point where clinical trials protocol and execution are fit for purpose for the questions that are being asked, and not complicated by a whole bunch of things that may be intellectually interesting, but do not necessarily add to what the trial is really supposed to answer. I listed a number of all our guidances, the guidances that we have issued around this. The slides are going to be available, so if anyone is interested in looking at some of our guidances, you have the links here. This is not something that we can do alone at FDA. We need to have a multi-pronged approach that spans multiple stakeholders, including the academic community, including NIH, and potentially even payers. And when it comes to sort of the modalities that we have at our disposal, specifically at FDA, we have a significant role in working with researchers and companies on clinical trial design and execution. And so we do have a role in striving for simplicity, appropriate simplicity, or sometimes appropriate complexity in the design and execution of clinical trials. But fundamentally, we do have a role, I believe, when it comes to ensuring, facilitating, having clinical trials that are sort of fit for purpose for what they're supposed to answer. And that includes clinical trial designs, statistical analysis plan, and also quality and quality by design, meaning that the quality of clinical trials should really should really be organized around quality by design principles, and the fact that quality is should include those aspects of quality that are meaningful and that have a direct impact on the outcomes of the trial. The other tool that we have at our disposal is technology, and as you know, FDA has been advancing the use of digital health technologies. We are doing a lot of work in guidance. We're doing work in even sponsoring some work. For instance, thanks to the Act for ALS legislation that has allowed us, has given us funds to issue grants. So we are funding a study that is looking at developing a telemedicine version of the main scale to measure function for patient with ALS. And this is going, if you can imagine, given the mobility and functional problems that patients with ALS have, having a scale that allows evaluation of their function without the patient on a wheelchair having to trek to a clinical investigative site represents a significant advance. And here I really would like to thank Congress, and in particularly Congresswoman Eshoo for the Act for ALS legislation, which is really helping us move the needle in that space. And last but not least, as I just mentioned, legislation can be a major enabler and relevant to what we're discussing today. We now have the DPhil Act, which was included in the recently passed omnibus legislation that is allowing us to use even more muscle when it comes to advancing the improving clinical trial design and enhancing the diversity of clinical trials. We have a lot more to do. As I said, we have made significant gains, and there's some therapeutic areas where we have really been able to move the needle. There are others where there is a lot of work to be done, and you have heard Laura speak about oncology. I will use the examples of Alzheimer's disease. Historically, Alzheimer's disease trial have included low single-digit numbers of non-white patients. This is something that is beginning to change. And we're seeing some of the more recent studies that are finally reflecting a more diverse population. But certainly the area, for instance, in neuroscience and psychiatry, historically, it has been an area where that has lagged over other therapeutic areas. Now, I just want to leave you with a few thoughts and about sort of how I see the to-do list. First and foremost, planning for a diverse and inclusive clinical trial needs to be a standard approach and not the exception. And so this entails early planning by researchers and companies. And by early planning, I mean that there should be a deliberate strategy and plan for diverse recruitment, starting in the pre-NDA phase, pre-IND phase, meaning that meaning before the trial goes into humans, because a clinical diversity recruitment plan is something that really has to span the entire breadth of the development of a drug. And so to this point, researchers and companies should come to us early. And, ideally, they should come to us, they should start talking about these strategies at the very first touch point with FDA. As I mentioned earlier, we need to strike the right balance when it comes to collection of information and the need to make clinical trials feasible. And so appropriate simplification of clinical trials protocols and execution is very much on the to-do list. We also need to leverage tools and technologies to bring clinical trials to the patients. We'll be talking about this more during the panel today. The example that I gave you for ALS is something that really should apply to all therapeutic areas. There are some things that clearly cannot be done via telemedicine. There are some things that certainly requires the patient to to go to an investigative sites and to be evaluated in person. However, there are a lot of things that really don't. And so leveraging digital health technologies and some of the tools that we have by necessity have had to use and learn to use during the pandemic is very much on the to-do list. All of this has to be sensible. We need to strike a balance against making development programs impossible to execute. And so that's going to be a challenge. And I know that there are some very loud voices in industry that are express concerns about making sure that we effect this change in a sensible and realistic way. Legislation will definitely help. The PICT Act will help. And again, thank you to Congresswoman Eshoo for being a champion for this legislation. This legislation will really focus us even to a greater extent on improving clinical trial design and enhancing diverse recruitment. FDA is currently implementing the legislation. For instance, we have established a diversity plan implementation committee that will really be driving the implementation of the legislation and also the adoption of our guidances. The availability of clinical trials for underserved populations is also intrinsically tied to the availability and access to healthcare. And this is something that I know is outside of FDA swim lane. However, we cannot fool ourselves that we will be able to move the needle when it comes to diversity in clinical trials without really also addressing and taking a start look at the profound inequities when it comes to availability and access to healthcare. And last but not least, as you heard from Laura, there is a place for medical journal or a potential place for medical journals. And I will stretch this a little farther at the risk of being a little provocative today. And I know that Lee is going to join us later today, that there may even be a role for payers to create the right incentives for developers to include in clinical trials patients that represent the people who will ultimately take the drug. So I'm going to stop here and turn over to Laura.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll dispense with the slides and get right into it, because we're here to talk about what we've just heard about, what the FDA can do, but what the institutions of higher learning can do, advocacy organizations, Congress, we're going to hear from Congresswoman Eshoo herself, and pharma and biotech companies can do to really change the game here. So we have 4 panelists, Dr. Ramona Siqueira, the president of Takeda Pharmaceuticals and the incoming board chair of PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, has had an emergency and is unable to join us, but has sent me some of the comments that she wanted to make. She, by the way, is the first woman in pharma's history to be the board chair, and she currently serves as the president of Takeda Pharmaceuticals. We're also joined by Dr. Michael Drake, who's the president of the University of California and a long-term colleague and friend. He was on the UCSF faculty in ophthalmology and then went on to become the chancellor at Irvine, the president of Ohio State, and we are so fortunate to have him as the president of UC, and a physician himself and an academic leader, outspoken, and will pull no punches. He is in a position to discuss why this problem has persisted, who we're training and why it matters, and what institutions can do about it. Ricki Fairley, to his left, founder and CEO of Touch, the Black Breast Cancer Alliance. She has founded and is pushing a communication strategy when we trial that all of us should be joining her on to explain why we need clinical trials and why Black women in particular need to be part of this movement. She's just an amazing advocate. She's a triple-negative breast cancer survivor working on demystifying trials for Black women. If you haven't met her, You have a rare treat. She's fierce and effective, and she is making a difference. We are also very fortunate to have Dr. Sohail Rao. He is the Executive Vice President for Research and Leadership Development and the founding CEO of DHR Health Institute for Research and Development, Doctors Hospital Renaissance. He's going to explain, this is a large hospital at a border town in Texas, Edinburgh, Texas, and has been remarkably successful in recruiting patients to trials. Their population is 90% Hispanic and 80% underserved. But they have made research a priority. We're going to learn how that happened and why that matters. And then finally, in about 10 minutes, we're going to be joined by Congresswoman Eshoo, who is the chair of the Healthcare Subcommittee under Appropriations, very powerful position, or at least she was until the things changed. So she will be the ranking member. She'll be the ranking member, but has successfully introduced the legislation that will make it impossible for people to fail to be transparent about who they're accruing. And hopefully we'll talk about the Clinical Trial Coverage Act, making sure that gets through in this next contentious Congress. So I think we're going to get right into it with the first question, and we'll go in the order of, like, what do you think, we're going to start with, what do you think are the key reasons for persistence of the lack of diversity in trials? And Michael, we're going to start with you.
Well, first, great to see everyone here and to be able to do this in person after several years of doing this virtually. So it's nice to see everyone, and glad that this has persisted and is moving forward, and glad to have UCSF and Stanford working together so actively on this. I think, Laura, when you and I first worked together intensively and specifically was at the time of the merger of the UCSF and Stanford. That was a moment in time, but time of the merger many years ago, and so great to have that consistent long-term partnership continuing, and to see everyone here today. And I also will say to Kuldev, we probably worked together in the 90s at the beginning, and one of the things that we were working on back then was a study. We're both glaucoma specialists, and we're working on a thing called the Ocular Hypertension Treatment Study, OHTS, O-H-T-S. And a colleague of ours and mine, Roy Wilson, and I were on a planning committee for OHTS at the very, very beginning, which would have been 30-ish years ago. And one of the things that we had learned as glaucoma specialists, as glaucoma trainees, was that glaucoma was worse in black patients. There was the worst glaucoma. And what that meant was what was a black patient wasn't really clearly defined. What was worse, those things weren't clearly defined. But we had this kind of a nebulous concept that this was a worse disease in certain populations. And so as the OHTS study was being designed, we wrote into the design parameters that 25% of the patients in the study were going to be African American or black. Some were Afro-Caribbean. But 25% of the patients were going to be black was a part of the design of this large multi-center national trial from the very beginning. And it turned out to be, and then we had to figure out how to do that. And one of the things that we'd all seen, I participated in lots of clinical research, went on the faculty here at UCSF, and one of the things that we found, one of the things I remember learning then was that if you looked at the patients in those studies, this data point stuck in my mind was that the average level of education of a patient in a clinical trial was about 1 year of graduate school. And that really didn't mirror the population as a whole. Then why would it be that reflected the patients in these clinical trials? And for me, I did the clinical trials up on Parnassus at UCSF, and so it really reflected the patient population that we were seeing, and your friends and colleagues, the people who were there kind of ready, set to join the study, were a subset of the population, people who were seen at academic medical centers because that was more, at least that was more convenient. And we began then with our study knowing that wasn't going to be enough at that time. And again, I'll look at Calder from memory, but there were data showing that if you looked at all of the patients who'd been in all the clinical trials, all the drug trials for glaucoma drugs prior to that time, 50 or 60 were black patients. There were a few thousand patients that had been in the trials. When you add them up together, a handful of patients who were the ones who were seen as being most vulnerable. And so we said, gosh, we have to do something to design this differently. And so we made a whole series of things that were parts of the study that were required to change the population of people that we had in the study, and a 25% goal was one of those. Roy was the dean at the Charles R. Drew Medical School, Martin Luther King Hospital in LA at the time, so a hospital based in a minority community that helped a lot. And we really had to go to where the patients were to be able to draw them into the study, to be able to learn the things we wanted to learn. And I will say, and I'll have a couple other things to share later on that I'll wait for, but I'll say that by doing that, we did in fact get a population that was different than that had been studied before. We had several hundred patients that were African American, and we learned things about that patient population that we hadn't thought of learning, that we couldn't have learned if we hadn't had so many patients, like central corneal thickness differences, which I found fascinating and something that hadn't been considered before, but was found in this subset of the population and was then a predictor for worse glaucoma outcomes. So I think that there are many things naturally that led to our business as usual, being that we would examine and work with and treat and learn from certain types of patients. And what we've had to do, and what we've known for decades, is that we had to do business that was not business as usual to be able to change that and to include other people in our studies. And when we did that, we learned things that were different about those patients and about the studies and about the diseases we were treating broadly. And so I think it's a long-term thing that we've known about for years. We have ways of dealing with it, but we really have to consistently apply those methods if we're going to have differences in outcome. And I have something else I'll add later, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, okay, because we want to find out like why you think, I mean, it's not like we don't know what to do, we're just not doing it, right?
Yeah, I think we know things that work. We've done things that work. It's kind of obvious that we can do things that work. It's obvious that things haven't been done, and we have to then move. We have to change the way that we behave if we're going to get different outcomes, and I think that's very important.
So I think that leads perfectly to you, Ricki. So, you know, why is this such a difficult problem?
Well, I think what you spoke to, Dr. Drake, is really important, is that we have to be intentional about it. And I heard sort of the FDA mandate earlier, and frankly, and I think this is what you did, was it really has to be bigger than the percent of the population. It has to be commensurate with the burden of disease. And in the breast cancer lane, you know, though Black women have a lower incidence of breast cancer than white women, our mortality rate is 41% higher. Our recurrence rate is 39% higher. Black women under 35 get breast cancer at twice the rate of white women, die at 3 times the rate. And we need different drugs. The drugs are not working for us in the way that they need to be. And we need to be considered commensurate with the burden of disease. I'm alive because I took some experimental drugs. My doctor gave me 2 years to live with triple-negative breast cancer. I'm on 11. But I took experimental drugs at the time that are now standard of care. And what we've learned from our research, Laura, is really that there's just a lack of understanding in the Black community about clinical trials. First of all, doctors aren't inviting us to clinical trials. That's the biggest problem. But really, there's a significant fear of the unknown. So you add to that earned medical mistrust that's sort of in our community, but it's really fear of the unknown. We don't understand how the science works. We don't understand standard of care. We don't understand really what the benefits of trials are, and so we shy away from them because we don't know. And until people in our ecosystem get intentional, as you did, Dr. Drake, and really explain it to them, reach out to them in a different way, and you can't, the standard way of doing it is not working, you have to do it differently, then we get a response. And with our campaign, which we'll speak to a little bit later, we signed up 5,000 Black women into clinical trial portals in 6 months because we did it in a different way. We used the voice of a breastie. You know, patients do not trust doctors. They do not trust researchers. They do not trust pharmaceutical companies. They trust patients. They trust people who are in the same position as them. And when we use the voice of a breastie to educate about trials to Black women, it worked. And I think we found a way to engage them but it had to be done in a different way with significant intentionality.
I think that's right. You know, we had the experience in the wisdom study. We thought, oh, you just open it up, you know, take it out of the academic trial, open it up to the whole population, voila, everything would look like the population. After 2.5 years, we had 1% enrollment of African-American women, and we've turned to people like Ricki and others to really help us. We've worked really hard over 2 to 3 years. Our last quarter, we had 16% enrollment, but it is hard. And really, you can't, you know, someone like me is not the right person to take the message. Okay, so and Congresswoman Eshoo, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go to Sohail, and then we're going to go to you next. Okay, Sohail, why, you know, what do you think has been responsible for the persistence of this problem? And then in our second question, we're going to talk about what people are, how people are going about change. Go ahead, Sohail.
Good morning. My apologies for not being there in person. Mother Nature had different ideas. But thank you, Laura, for inviting me to this particular meeting. Let me put this in context of who we are and where we are headed. About 20 years ago, so we are basically serving the border town in the deeper part of South Texas, which is called the South Pole of United States. We have a population of about 2 million that we actually serve. About 20 years ago, the physicians in this particular area decided that they actually want to change the delivery of healthcare, which was largely supported at that time and delivered by corporate hospitals. So they put together a physician-owned hospital, which is now the largest physician-owned hospital in the United States, in one of the counties, the Hidalgo County in Edinburgh. And about 6 or 7 years ago, they came to this idea that without research, this particular hospital's mission is not going to be fulfilled. It's a level 1 trauma center. It has comprehensive stroke program. It's the only solid organ transplant program in the south of Texas, south of San Antonio. So they actually invited me to set up this non-for-profit research institute. When I joined in 2019, we were actually doing 11 studies, most of which were quality studies, retrospective QI interventions. We are today, I just closed 2022 with a little over 290 studies funded by the NIH, by the federal agency, you name any pharmaceutical company out there or CRO. We have master agreement and affiliations with them. This is a very unique region. And so this all happened in the last 4 years. When I joined, we were 4 people, including myself. We are now close to 50 people in the Research Institute. And it's all because of the strong partnership that this particular institute has built with DHR and also with the state, I must say. The state is extremely supportive of some of the work that we are doing in this part of the country. Now, this is a very unique region and a unique population. As Laura said, this is a border town. It has got a population that we serve of over 2 million people, which in reality is not a small population. It's actually more than combined North and South Dakota, if you may just put something in context. It's also one of the fastest growing communities in the United States. It has a very poor access to medical care. There are a number of rural areas. It's a very high incidence of underinsured or uninsured people. The poverty levels are very high. And because of all the things that I have just mentioned, and also, by the way, somebody mentioned the educational level. I think it was the previous speaker. But the level of education is also something to be desired. The chronic diseases, any chronic disease that you can think of is in double digits. I mean, if you say it's more than 20% and you had no idea what the percentage was, you probably would be close to right. So the chronic diseases are extremely high, from diabetes to cancers to cardiovascular diseases, you name it. There is also a palpable cultural resistance to getting involved in clinical research among Hispanics. It's more than 95% of the people are Hispanics of Latino region here. And there is a palpable resistance to getting, and because of all these, there is also very high, even if we do recruit patients, there is a very high incidence of loss to follow-up for the things that I have just mentioned. So what have we tried to do? Clearly, doing the same thing that we have done in the past is not going to work because it required some really disruptive intervention. So one of the things we did was that we actually started educational programs. We used to go to bingo parties. We went to malls. We went to healthcare fairs, but these were patients talking to the patients. It was not physicians or coordinators talking to the patients. It was not physicians or coordinators talking to the public. It was the patients who have been benefited from being part of clinical trials who actually went out, devoted their time and their energy to actually recruit and inform their colleagues. We also partnered with local chamber of commerce so that we can actually be part of that. We even went to colonias, which are actually very, very important areas that we need to focus on. And what we realized was, in this particular process, that the people we were talking to, perhaps, it's important, but perhaps were not the right people. These were first generation individuals who have come into this particular country. They went into farming, they worked hard to actually put 2 meals on the table. Their understanding of what we were talking, although it was in their language, from their colleagues, from their friends, was not very high. They were actually going back to their kids, those who were in high school and colleges, asking them for advice. So we started a program working with 52 independent school districts of how we can actually teach high school students the importance of research, the crisis of public health crisis that is going through in this particular part of the world. And that has actually, that's almost like cover to cover, making sure that everyone with the need to know knows about the importance of research and how it can minimize the public health crisis that is going on. What else did we do? We took research to the patients. We understood that these are uninsured patients, that their access to medical care is very poor. So we decentralized the clinical trials. We now have clinical coordinators and physician and mid-level providers who actually go to patients' home for follow-up visits. So the patient doesn't have to come to our center. So that's one of the important thing, and a very important one is C3FIT, which is the post-discharge stroke care, which is funded by the federal government. And in this particular trial, although there are 18 centers in the United States, we are, along with Vanderbilt, the center which has actually recruited the most patients in the shortest possible period of time. And that's because we created this decentralized clinical trial model. We are also creating a brick and mortar facilities which are distinct from the main center, so that patients can come there for more advanced treatment like infusion therapies or any other treatment that they need. And for that, I must congratulate and thank the state for partnering with us in moving it forward. We also created a very strong print and digital marketing strategy. And I think that combination of all of those have actually helped us in reaching out to more people in the community and to being more receptive to the needs of the community in terms of getting them involved in clinical research. And I'll stop there, and if there is any question, I'm more than happy to respond.
Yeah, we're definitely going to come back to that. So Congresswoman Eshoo, your bill, thank you, got through in the omnibus. So tell us a little bit about why you sponsored this and like what it was like to get it through.
Well, first of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Laura, Dr. Patrizia, everyone that is participating in this. It's really an honor to be with you, and thanks for allowing me to get to Mass today. We have a lot to pray for in our country. So,
well, we're glad you're here. We weren't sure you were going to be here, but fantastic.
For those that are interested in the liturgical calendar, today is the Feast of the Epiphany. So may there be an epiphany in our country to do right and do good. When I looked at the FDA data on the drugs that were approved in 2020, 75% of clinical trial participants were white. only 8% of trial participants were African Americans and 11% were Hispanic. So fixing this inequity, in my view, is not only fair and just, it's also good science. So my legislation, the DPICT Act, which, as you said, thankfully became law in the end of the year omnibus, requires drug makers to report to the FDA how they'll include a representative patient group in their clinical trials. And this will be the first time that there's ever been a standard for diversity in clinical trials in law. In the past, the FDA has sought to improve clinical trial diversity through voluntary guidance. My legislation requires now the FDA to issue guidance to promote decentralized clinical trials. And these types of trials use digital health technology and telehealth to allow for a really meaningful, diverse clinical population. And these decentralized trials were a huge improvement during COVID and need to continue. The legislation also requires the FDA to hold public meetings on the flexibilities initiated during COVID for clinical trials to inform the agency of other potential guidance it could issue to improve diversity in clinical trials. And the legislation also requires the FDA to hold a public workshop on enhancing clinical trial diversity and issue a report on progress to increase diversity. Obviously, no matter what we do, there's also more to be done. Congresswoman Jackie Spears' legislation, the Clinical Trial Coverage Act, is an important bill that needs to pass. And I'm going to pick up the baton that she carried this Congress, because it requires insurance coverage for the health services provided to individuals that participate in an approved clinical trial. And we know from the legislation that she was successful in getting over the finish line in the state legislature. This is already law in California, and it's been hugely helpful. I'm also looking into ways to legislatively encourage more diversity in trials by diversifying the clinical staff that recruits trial participants. Also to ensure that advertising materials for trials are translated and culturally appropriate, and providing more patient support, which is really so important for people, such as transportation costs, childcare costs. Very often, those two issues are disabling to people, and I think would enable them to be participants. So that's on the front burner in the 118th Congress, but I'm really thrilled that my legislation made it through, with the omnibus. So
I thank you for that, because it's really a huge step forward. And I will say, Jackie Spears' legislation in California, I worked on that bill with her when she was a state senator, and this is about access. If trials are only available in certain places, and if you can't go and get your standard of care at the place where the trials are, you basically can't participate. So this is a matter of equity. It's super important, and we use that all the time in California. But this, and does your bill also mean now that you can consult with someone across state lines about a trial, and you don't have to force them to fly to your state or wherever you are?
Exactly.
It's because we have to figure out how to enforce that. That's super important too. That's changed, Michael, that all the UC medical centers have to change policy, because that was open during COVID, and then all of a sudden they shut the door on it. Now you just see this is the law.
Right.
Okay, thank you. All right, so All right, we have, so Patrizia, why don't you tee up the second question, and then we'll open up to a couple questions in the audience.
Yeah, certainly. The next question that we would like to pose to the panel is, and we've heard about this already to some extent. So what are the key things that your organization is trying to accomplish to make a change? And since we've already, heard a lot of this previously, you may also want to sort of specifically speak to what is missing by each group working on their own, and how can we, leverage the collective to turbocharge our efforts?
Okay, Michael.
Let's start with Michael.
Yeah.
Yes, great. And I'll go quickly. I know there's a lot to share, and let me be a little weird and kind of go to a wider angle lens on all this and think, why does this still happen? Why is this still a problem? Why are we still talking about this like it's something new that we need to address when it's been there for decades? It's been there always. Why don't we make better progress on it? And that's I think something we have to address if we're going to be successful. And we've all had this experience of preaching to the choir, and the choir all agrees, and that's great. But the choir is really not representative of the whole world, and it's the whole world that we need to change more to be more effective. So I'm going to touch on a couple things. One, Congresswoman, you mentioned the support of people who are going to participate in clinical trials and how important that is. And I mentioned earlier in some of the ones that we had done, we found that it was the people who came to see us who were the ones that were in the trials, but that was a really small fraction of the overall population. Those are people who had great care. They were already at UCSF for getting their care, so they already had that. They weren't the broad world people who weren't connected. A little bit like bankers used to be. You had to go to the bank between 10 and 3, Monday through Friday, and the banker's hours made it hard to get your money. It's much easier now with ATMs and other things and working online than it was back then because we've opened up the access. So one of the things that we did, even in those years, when it was considered strange to pay people to be in clinical trials, so there were ethical considerations. To be honest, what we did, and I think the statute of limitations has run out, is that I covered their expenses, and so I would give people money for parking and other things like that that they needed for the trial. To be honest, what I did is I gave them much more money than I thought their costs were going to be, whether or not they had the costs. So you would get $50 to come for your visit, to pay for your parking and we didn't ask you whether or not those costs were actually there. We just wanted to make it that there was something that helped to support your taking the time and effort to come to the trial, and it meant that we had more people show up at the trial, and then people actually kept their appointments because there was always something that they got for coming. So that was done, again, 25, 30 years ago. There was a study recently looking during the COVID pandemic at participation in clinical trial. It was an experimental study done, I'm talking fast now just for time, but experimental study done by economists at the University of Chicago. And the concept was, does payment of, when you pay patients, does it change the way that they comply with the requirements of being in a trial? And the trial that they suggested to people, and they did this through mail order so they could have it be across different demographic and population bases within Chicago. They wanted patients to do a finger stick and test for COVID antibodies. That was the premise. And they asked people, and they tried to see how much feedback they would get if they paid patients nothing for doing this. And about 6% of the people who got the questionnaire said, yes, they would be able to they'd be willing to do a finger stick and mail in their samples. When they said, well, what if there were $100 was given to you for doing this thing? Then they found that they went from about 6% to about 17% of people said they were willing to do that. That was interesting, but fascinatingly, they found that it was very minority versus non-minority populations, no money, 6%, very low compliance, or very low interest in the study. When they said $100, then the white population went up to about 20%. and the minority population went up a little bit, but actually there was a greater disparity then in the white and minority population at $100 because you cranked up, you increased the number of the white patients who said they'd be willing to do the finger stick. When they said it would be $500, that then closed the gap and raised the number to about 30%. And so what was found is that there was a correlation between the level of compensation and the interest that patients had in participating in the study, and that no compensation had patients not so interested. A moderate level actually increased the disparity, and then a higher level closed the gap. And so that was just an interesting thing that looked at what it took to make it that people were willing and able and interested in participating in your study. And I think that we have to look broadly at that. If we're thinking about being successful, we have to actually look at those things that are going to bring people to us to make them work with us. But I have one other I'll save for a little bit later, but I'll stop there.
All right, so Ricki, I know this would be a time, maybe, can we cue up Ricki's video? Because this is something your organization has been working on as a way to get to people.
Yeah, this is a snapshot of one of our
So a
videos.
trial to me is access. It's opportunity. It's living. It's reclaiming my time and space in an effort that may not be possible. Especially women of color, we have to understand that a clinical trial is not the faux pas that it used to be. This is life-sustaining opportunities. It's a chance for me to do something so that people behind me don't have to. It's an opportunity to live longer and thrive and be present where in other situations you may not. So my perspective has definitely changed.
So yeah, we got breasties to talk to other breasties, and we have a video gallery. That's a snapshot of one of our videos. We actually had one of our breasties last week. We shot a new video, and she said, "I'm participating in a clinical trial because I'm building a medical trust fund for my 3 daughters." And so statements like that, and like what you just saw from Lakia, are making a difference in how Black women are talking. I think you talked earlier about, we're all preaching to this choir. I think the problem is our choir is still small. And for the rest of the world, they have to admit that their baby is ugly. And that's what I tell pharma companies every day. There's an ad that I keep getting served on Facebook right now from, I won't name the company, but they're obviously looking for older Black women for a pneumonia trial, a pneumonia vaccine trial. And so it's a beautiful ad on Facebook with Black people in the ad, but when you click on the ad, you only see white people. And so it's like, the marketing is bad and how they're talking is bad. You have to be intentional, as I said earlier, about what you're doing, how thorough it is, and you have to make people feel safe and comfortable and explain the science. And so that's what we're really trying to do. And though we've signed up 5,000 women, it's like a drip in the bucket of where we need to be to change those percentage numbers of participation. But I think we'll keep plugging away at it. But using the patient voice is really what's making a difference. And that's how we're going to help you with the wisdom study, because we believe patients. And that's what we're doing. And that's what's working. And we're hoping that more organizations will adopt our When We Trial. If you go to whenwetrial.org and look at our video gallery, you can sort of see the work. And hopefully more people will look at that, and it will, expand across other disease states. But in breast cancer, I can't rest until I work for my 3 granddaughters. The oldest one is 5. And I can't rest until I can at least get mortality rate parity for Black women. I don't want anybody to die of breast cancer, but Black women deserve mortality rate parity, and that's only going to come with better science.
That's right, and that actually will help everyone. And that's it's the sum of us. We all have to remember that these findings, right, they may help Black women, but there will be white women who get the same kind of disease, and that better understanding of science is good. This is really so important. So Sohail, like what your 2-year time horizon, what you're able to do with your organization.
So I think there were, again, thank you, Laura. Again, there were 2 things that I did not mention in our disruptive intervention. One of them was that we are a multi-specialty hospital, so we are largely a referral hospital. The patients first go to the PCPs, and then they are referred to us for specialty care. one of the things that we were missing in our portfolio was the ability to actually reach out to the PCP and educate them about the various clinical trials that are available right in their backyard. They don't need to actually refer the patient to San Antonio or Houston. The patient can actually stay at home with their loved ones and get the same level of care and access to clinical care right here at home. So that was something that we did. We actually now have monthly meetings with our primary care providers. You give them food, you bring them in after 6 in the evening, and 500 show up. And so that is what we have started to do. These are called primary care meetings. And we actually provide them with updates about and thank them for sending the patients. And we actually use one of the patients that they had sent. We bring them in so that they can actually speak to their experience as far as their involvement in clinical trial is concerned. The second thing we learned, and it was a hard lesson, was make it relevant. You can't be talking to them about clinical trials and diseases that are not prevalent in that particular society or in that particular part of the region. And I'll give you a very specific example, which has led to a change in the way we treat patients with coronary artery disease. So what we were learning was that people who had coronary artery disease and were stented, there was a revolving door. They were either coming with a lot of bleeding or the stent has actually shut off, it's coagulated. And it was not clear as to what was happening. Now, one of the things that happens in our cardiology cath lab is that they get these pre-printed orders that you're going to, these are the two drugs that you're going to take, Plavix and aspirin, period. And they start that particular drug. What we have, as many of you know, Plavix is an inactive drug and it has to be activated by a specific enzyme. I'm not going to go into the details. So we said, let's see if this, what is the role of this particular enzyme in this particular population? And when we start this particular study, we recruited about 350 patients in a short period of about a year. We realized that 20% of these individuals actually either have overactive enzyme or underactive enzyme. So they would either bleed or they would either coagulate. And so it is now a medical practice at our institution where every patient, whether it's through emergency or elective, has to get their genotyping done for the CYP3 enzyme, which is the enzyme that converts it. And we basically then, based on that, we actually, if it is over or underactive, we move them to a different blood thinner. So this was one specific example in our population of more than 94% Latinos and Hispanics that we were able to make, which actually made 2 out of 10 people were either bleeding or they came back and get restented and restented and restented. So that was one of the things that we did. So make it relevant and reach out to the PCPs so that they are aware of the clinical trials that are going on.
So it's so important, and just going to show you're out there doing the hard work and making it happen. So amazing. As it just goes to show persistence, innovation can do it.
Can I add one thing, Laura? I think
Yeah.
that I'm seeing here that's so important is being in the community.
Yeah,
And
being in the community is so
Being in the
important.
community, and you know, I kind of say it, we want to be where Black women live, work, play, pray, and slay. And so we took our campaign into the community, into organizations that aren't health-related necessarily.
So we obviously need more support for that, Congresswoman Eshoo. I'm a little concerned about the ability to get things done in this next Congress. Is there an opportunity to, what can we all do to try and bring more bipartisan support for these issues? How can we approach some of the additional things that we've talked about today to make this happen, like the Clinical Trial Coverage Act, other things that you talked about, more compensation, more resources to build these centers in the community where people are?
Well, I think every member of Congress, regardless of their congressional district or what side of the aisle they're on, that they need to hear from the professionals in their own community. And that's very important. It's very, very important. I think that as that takes place, or, hopefully it'll take place, to build the bipartisan support that's needed to keep moving on really making diversity in clinical trials, work, that they hear from the professionals, the doctors, the specialists, whomever it may be, that they meet with their member, and if they're not acquainted with what we've already done, that be stated and why it's important, and then also the ask. The ask is probably, I would think, legislation that's introduced, and that you're asking that member to be a part of the effort, and that previous efforts on this very issue have been bipartisan. It's very important. So that can be done. I've seen it. I've helped build it on other issues, and it works.
All right, well, we're going to work with you on it. So everyone
Good.
attending this meeting, we're going to send you some information about how you can support these things. This is about mom and apple pie. So let's all get it done, and we'll send you that information. And I want to say that Dr. Siqueira said, this is her draft statement from pharma: establishing sustainable and representative diversity in the clinical trial development of new medicines is a moral, public health, and business imperative for the biopharmaceutical industry. As chair of pharma and an industry leader at Takeda, I've been personally and professionally invested in helping to advance systemic solutions to this issue. And she thinks this is essential work to remove the barriers to care and help reshape systems to work for all, not just some. And we have to put the patients first, meet the individuals where they are, careful listening, and to meet the individuals and communities. And I think that pharma is dedicated to really setting up some of these centers across the country in underserved areas, and that's something that is not an individual effort. All of us have to work together on this. I think everyone doing it on their own is much less effective than everyone working together. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry that we're running late and I can't take questions, but I'm going to have a quick lightning round so everyone gets their last 30 seconds, okay? What do you think we can embark on that would be practical and effective? What is it that you think from this panel you're going to do differently to really make sure that we have a change? Michael.
Yeah, I'll speak as fast as I can for 30 seconds. I think there's something else that I think there's kind of an elephant in the room that we've not talked about, and that is that how could things be so bad for so long with everybody knowing so much about it? Oh my goodness. And it's not just that we're all educated and thoughtful and smart and ethical and great, and if everybody just knew what we knew, then they would do what we do and agree with us, and these things would go away, because actually I think they know that already. And the way the enterprise is set up is that there are disparities and there is exclusion that affects huge numbers of the people in our population, and those persist not by accident. They persist not by ignorance. They take willful effort to be maintained. And if we act as though, well, gosh, if we just do the right thing in the right way and make everybody smart and show these clear data, this will go away. That's not true. That's been shown. People know these things, and they don't go away. I'll just speak, coming from an issue. One of your colleagues, I think, recently was elected, and it was revealed that his CV was largely fabricated, and so this person is a fraud. And elected based on a history that turns out not to be true, but that actually doesn't seem to matter. I mean, okay. And so it's not just knowing what's true and knowing what's right and knowing what needs to be done. Exactly. It takes real intentional effort to work against those forces that have created these disparities, to actively push back against them every day. And if we don't, if you don't, if I don't, then they continue to persist. When we do, we can make progress. I really want to thank everyone here and on the screen who actively works on this energy-requiring effort every day to push back against those things that tend to make these disparities such a scourge on our society.
And misinformation is a big part of it. I've already drafted Michael Drake for the next panel for the next year, misinformation. Okay.
We live in a world of health inequity. There is no health equity. And how can we get to health equity? And it really is as simple as the golden rule, what your mother taught you when you were 2 years old. Treat others as you want to be treated. And I challenge patients all the time to go back to the doctor and say, is this what you would recommend for your mom, your auntie, your grandma, your daughter? And I think every day we assume that what we're doing probably isn't the right thing because everything is bad right now. So treat others as you want to be treated. And think about that in your work and everything that you do. And I think we would have a different medical outcome if we treated others as you want to be treated.
Okay, great point. All right, Sohail.
So I think I would take the example of the pandemic. When the first patient was identified up in Washington State on the 16th of January 2020, we very quickly realized that there is no infrastructure for research and this tsunami is going to hit and wipe out the majority of the people here in the South Texas. So what did we do? We realized that we alone cannot take care of it. So we created a consortium of 11 hospitals across the entire South Texas, 92 physicians, and 4 health districts. And we took the lead in actually doing everything that was possible from early on, from convalescent plasma to monoclonal antibodies, to long-term antibodies, to remdesivir.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that we are lacking right now, that we are now working, we have not learned. We published it, but we really did not learn. We disbanded this particular collaborative. We are putting this collaborative back because we have realized that although we are doing 300 studies, it's not enough.
Okay.
We have to partner with others.
Collaboration is key. All right. Yes. Congresswoman Eshoo.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me. In listening to each person speak, I was just reminded myself of when I first entered the Congress, women were not included in clinical trials. So that was 30 years ago, and more women entered the Congress, and we've made progress. But I think the story of America is that we never are fully satisfied, nor should we be, with where we are. We're always seeking to push the edges of the envelope out. So, I'm here this morning speaking about my legislation, but also said to everyone that there's much more work to be done. We need to keep learning from each other. We need to keep refining. And we cannot be satisfied with the progress, be proud of the progress that's been made, but we have to be devoted to chipping away at these terrible inequities in our health system, in our country. And I think together in our day and time, we can. And I'm fully committed to that. With you.
All right, well, we're going to work together on finding some solutions. We'll be coming to you with some bipartisan legislation to continue to promote. On behalf of myself, Dr. Cavazzoni from the FDA, thank you so much. I'm sorry we ran over, but we're going to give you guys a 10 minutes,
15-minute break. We'll come back at 11:10, and you don't want to be late because Mark McClellan is going to open with his opening remarks are worth hearing. So. Back in 15 minutes.
Thank you
Laura.
So much,
Great
everybody.
panel. Thank you, Patricia, everybody.
Very nice to meet you. Keep up the good work. Yeah, keep up the good work.